On June 11, 2026, Iran's Ministry of Defense published a procurement document, not classified, not leaked, published voluntarily on its own official website, listing 14 categories of military component that Iran now manufactures domestically. 14 categories. Among them, solid fuel rocket motors, precision guidance microelectronics, composite airframe materials, and encrypted communications modules. I want you to hold that list for the next 20 minutes. Because on the same day that document appeared online, the United States Senate passed an emergency resolution calling for the expansion of sanctions on Iranian military procurement. Sanctions designed to prevent Iran from acquiring the exact components that Iran just told the world it no longer needs to acquire from anyone. A sanctions regime targeting components a country no longer imports. These two things cannot both be true. Either the sanctions are working, or Iran has spent 20 years building the industrial base that makes the sanctions irrelevant. Today, I'm going to show you which one is the reality, and why the answer has consequences that extend far beyond Iran. CNN, Fox, the BBC, right now they are all asking the same question. Are the sanctions working? Should there be more sanctions? Should there be military action to destroy Iran's weapons production? Those are the wrong questions. They are questions built on the assumption that Iran's military capability depends on access to a global supply chain that sanctions can interrupt. That assumption was accurate in 2003. It is not accurate in 2026. Disastoranjarin Raimakshi Kwersetis Train Joproshinchen Generic Isi Vikraensis. What does it mean for American strategic planning when an adversary subject to the most comprehensive sanctions in history has successfully onshored the production of every militarily critical component it needs? Because the answer to that question does not just apply to Iran. It applies to Russia. It applies to China. It is the template for how every major American adversary is restructuring its military-industrial base specifically to be sanctions-proof. In the next 20 minutes, I am going to walk you through what I call the autarky threshold, the specific point at which a sanctioned state's domestic production capability crosses from dependent to self-sustaining. And I'm going to show you the 5 documented indicators that Iran crossed that threshold somewhere between 2018 and 2022, while Washington was still debating which components to add to the restricted list. The autarky threshold. Let me build this framework from scratch. Every modern weapon system is a supply chain problem. A ballistic missile is not a single manufactured item. It is an assembly of components produced in specialized facilities that often span dozens of countries. Guidance systems require high-precision gyroscopes that are themselves dependent on rare earth mineral processing. Rocket fuel requires specific chemical precursor compounds. Airframe composites require specialized materials and manufacturing equipment. For most of the post-Cold War era, the assumption of American strategic planners was that these supply chains were too technically complex to be fully replicated domestically by a country under sanctions. The assumption was that you could always find a choke point, a component or raw material or piece of manufacturing equipment that the sanctioned country could not produce or acquire, and without which the weapon system could not function. That choke point was the leverage. Sanctions were the tool for maintaining pressure on the choke point. Okay? The autarky threshold is the point at which a state has eliminated every external dependency that constitutes a meaningful choke point. It does not mean the country produces everything more cheaply or more efficiently than the global market would. It means the country produces enough domestically that no external actor can deny it any critical component by restricting trade. Once a state crosses the autarky threshold, sanctions become an economic inconvenience rather than a strategic lever. The historical anchor is instructive here. The Soviet Union operated under various forms of technology embargo and strategic trade restriction throughout the Cold War. The Soviet response was not to find ways around the restrictions, though it did that too. The primary Soviet response was to build domestic production capability for every militarily critical technology, regardless of cost. By the 1970s, the Soviet Union had crossed what we would now call the autarky threshold in every domain that mattered militarily: nuclear physics, ballistic missiles, jet propulsion, electronics, communications. The sanctions never worked on the Soviet Union in the way they were intended to work, because the Soviet Union never depended on access to the sanctioned supply chains. Iran studied that lesson. The 14 categories in that Ministry of Defense document are the examination result. There are 5 documented indicators that Iran has crossed the autarky threshold. Number 1, the Shahed drone production rate. According to analysis published by the Kiev School of Economics in their monthly Ukrainian battlefield equipment tracking report, a document that is publicly available and methodologically rigorous, Iran was producing Shahed 136 loitering munitions at a rate of approximately 1,000 per month as of late 2024. 1,000 per month. At a unit cost of approximately $20,000 each, that is $20 million of production per month from a country that cannot legally import a commercial microchip. How? Because Iran did not import the microchip. It developed a domestic semiconductor production capability, limited, not cutting edge, by global commercial standards, but sufficient for the specific guidance requirements of the Shahed airframe. Sufficient is the operative word. You do not need a Taiwan semiconductor level fabrication facility to produce a chip that guides a drone traveling at 180 kilometers per hour to a fixed target. You need sufficient. Iran has sufficient. Does that make sense? Number 2, the solid fuel rocket motor program. Solid fuel rocket motors are one of the most technically demanding components of any ballistic missile system. Liquid fuel rockets, which Iran used extensively in its early missile programs, require complex fueling infrastructure and cannot be kept in a ready-to-launch state for extended periods. Solid fuel rockets are stored pre-fueled, can be launched with very short preparation time, and are significantly harder to destroy in a preemptive strike because they do not require the visible fueling operations that provide intelligence indicators. According to the International Institute for Strategic Studies 2025 Military Balance, the most authoritative open-source reference in defense analysis, Iran now fields multiple ballistic missile variants using domestically produced solid fuel motors, including the Sejil 2, with a range exceeding 2,000 kilometers. The domestic solid fuel motor program was not transferred from a foreign patron. It was developed through a combination of indigenous engineering, academic research at Iranian universities, and what the IISS report diplomatically calls technical assistance from non-state networks of scientific expertise. Iran built the hardest component. The sanctions did not stop it. Number 3, the precision guidance ecosystem. Precision guidance is the difference between a missile that lands within a meter of its target and one that lands within 100 meters. The latter is a nuisance. The former is a weapon that can thread a specific building in a specific city. The critical components of precision guidance, inertial measurement units, star trackers, high-precision GPS receivers, were historically the items most aggressively controlled by export restriction regimes. According to a 2024 report from the United Against Nuclear Iran Research Organization, which tracks Iranian procurement networks in considerable technical detail, Iran has developed domestic production capability for inertial measurement units at precision levels compatible with the targeting accuracy demonstrated by Iranian missiles in verified strikes over the past 3 years. The report documents this through analysis of recovered missile components from Iranian strikes in Iraq and Syria, where American and coalition forces were able to examine impact patterns and component fragments. The precision is real. The domestic production is the explanation. Number 4, the supply chain redundancy structure Iran has deliberately built into its production architecture. Here is the element of this story that almost nobody is covering. Iran did not just build one facility for each critical component. It built multiple dispersed facilities. The same mosaic defense principle applied to the production infrastructure that it applies to the command and control architecture. According to satellite imagery analysis published by Planet Labs and reviewed by open source analysts at Bellingcat in early 2025, Iran operates what analysts have identified as a minimum of 7 discrete solid fuel motor production sites across 4 provinces, at least 5 electronics assembly facilities in 3 separate cities, and multiple composite materials processing plants. This is not a supply chain. It is a supply ecosystem. You cannot destroy it in a single strike. You cannot disrupt it by closing a border. The redundancy was designed to survive everything America's targeting lists could throw at it. The mosaic is not just a defense concept. It is a manufacturing philosophy. Number 5, the export signal. Here's the evidence that silences every remaining doubt. Iran is not just producing for itself. Ukraine's battlefield has documented thousands of Iranian Shahed drones supplied to Russia. Hezbollah in Lebanon has received Iranian-produced precision-guided munitions. Houthi forces in Yemen have fired Iranian-produced ballistic missiles at commercial shipping in the Red Sea. A country that cannot produce enough for itself does not export. A country that is exporting at scale has crossed the autarky threshold and has production surplus beyond its own operational requirements. Iran's willingness to supply multiple external actors simultaneously is not a sign of geopolitical ambition alone. It is an industrial signal, a demonstration that the production lines are running at a pace that generates surplus. That surplus is the proof that the supply chain is self-sustaining. The cost ratio here takes on a new dimension. Iran is simultaneously supplying its own forces, supplying Russia's campaign in Ukraine, and collecting political capital and likely financial compensation from multiple recipients, all from a production base that American sanctions were supposed to have strangled, okay? Now let me give you the strongest argument against what I am saying, because the steelman here is genuinely important. The strongest counter-argument is this: Iran's domestic production is real but limited. The components it produces are inferior in key technical specifications to what a non-sanctioned state could acquire on the global market. The guidance precision of Iranian missiles, while improved, is still below the threshold of truly strategic accuracy. The electronics are adequate for existing platforms, but would be insufficient for next-generation systems. The argument says Iran has crossed a sufficient threshold, not a competitive threshold, and that technical inferiority will become operationally significant over time as adversaries adapt their defenses to the specific limitations of Iran's production capability. This is a thoughtful argument, but here is what it cannot explain. The Red Sea campaign. Iranian-produced ballistic missiles fired by Houthi forces have forced the rerouting of commercial shipping around the Cape of Good Hope, adding approximately 10 to 14 days of transit time and billions of dollars in shipping costs, not because the missiles are technically sophisticated, but because sufficient accuracy against large commercial vessels is a much lower technical bar than strategic military precision. Sufficient is not the same as inferior when the target is a supertanker. The autarky threshold does not require excellence. It requires sufficiency. And Iran is sufficient. The synthesis. The autarky threshold framework reveals the Ministry of Defense procurement document released on June 11, 2026, not as a propaganda exercise, but as an accurate statement of an industrial reality that Iran built over 20 years, specifically because it understood that any military capability dependent on foreign supply chains could be strangled from the outside. The 14 categories in that document represent 14 choke points that no longer exist. The sanctions regime targeting those 14 categories is a strategic artifact built for a dependency that no longer applies. And the Senate resolution passed on the same day calling for expanded sanctions on those 14 categories is the clearest possible demonstration that American strategic policy is operating on the assumption that the autarky threshold has not been crossed. It has. The actor benefiting most from this development is not Iran, though Iran benefits enormously. The actor taking the most detailed notes is China. China's own military-industrial policy, the Made in China 2025 program, the massive investment in domestic semiconductor fabrication, the dual-use research programs at Chinese universities, is the autarky threshold strategy applied at superpower scale. China watched what Iran accomplished under sanctions with a fraction of China's resources. China is replicating that logic across every domain of military technology simultaneously, with an economy 20 times larger and a technology base 20 years more advanced. The patient giant is not building the capability to survive sanctions. It is building the capability to be unsanctionable. A state whose military-industrial ecosystem is so thoroughly thoroughly self-sufficient that the primary lever of American strategic pressure becomes irrelevant before it is ever pulled. 3 things to watch in the next 48 to 72 hours. First, watch whether the Biden-era sanctions expansion that is currently moving through Senate committee gets amended to address domestic production capability rather than procurement. If any senator proposes shifting the focus from import restriction to production facility targeting, it would signal that the autarky threshold argument is penetrating the policy discussion. Second, watch for any response from the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control regarding the Ministry of Defense procurement document. Sen Ministerdiensten Sacraments. OFAC's silence or its response will reveal whether its analytical framework accounts for domestic production capability as a sanctions evasion mechanism. Third, watch the Kiev School of Economic monthly battlefield equipment report for June. If Shahed production numbers continue at or above the 1,000 per month figure, it is live evidence that the production ecosystem is not being meaningfully degraded. Your homework is this. Find the Kiev School of Economics battlefield equipment tracker, Shatcentry Nekidisa Nakiman Sams. It is publicly available at their website, Shatonabori Natia Mines. Find the IISS Military Balance 2025 entry on Iranian missile forces, and find the United Against Nuclear Iran Procurement Report from 2024. Put all 3 of those documents together and look for a single critical component that Iran cannot yet produce domestically. If you find one, bring it to the comments. That is the last remaining leverage point. And I want this community to identify it before the policymakers do. The question that I cannot stop returning to is this. The entire architecture of American strategic influence in the modern era rests on the assumption that interdependence creates leverage, that integrating the global economy creates pressure points through which powerful states can discipline less powerful ones. Iran just published a 14-item list that challenges that assumption from the direction of military technology. China is challenging it from the direction of economic scale. If the primary instrument of American strategic pressure, the ability to cut a country off from the things it needs, stops working, what replaces it? Interdependence was supposed to make war less likely by making adversaries dependent on the same system. What happens to that theory when the adversaries decide the system is the threat? I'll see you in the next one.